The gun was already drawn when Caroline Atwood walked into the judge's office that Tuesday morning in April of 1883, and the man behind the desk had the nerve to be smiling. Judge Harlan Prout leaned back in his leather chair, fingers laced across his considerable belly, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he believes he already owns. The pistol on his desk was not pointed at her, not exactly, but it was there, and she understood its message as clearly as if he had pressed it to her temple and cocked the hammer. "I've had your answer once," he said, his voice carrying that particular smoothness that powerful men in small western towns cultivated the way they cultivated roses, carefully, deliberately, and for the sole purpose of display. "I thought perhaps a night's consideration might have softened your position." Caroline stood at the threshold of the door and did not move forward. Behind her, the main street of Harrow Creek, Texas, was filling with the ordinary noise of a Thursday morning in late spring, which made what was happening in this room feel even more impossible. The courthouse smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and something sour beneath both. "My position," she said, "has not changed." Harlan Prout's smile shifted, just slightly, just enough to reveal the trap beneath it. "Miss Atwood, I want you to understand something. The deed to your father's store, the note he signed with First Territorial Bank, those papers are currently sitting in a filing cabinet in this very office. They arrived on my desk 3 weeks ago when the bank appointed me as their legal representative in Harrow Creek. Your father passed those debts to you when he died, and you have perhaps 60 days before the bank exercises its right to claim the property." He paused. "Unless, of course, those debts were to be forgiven, which a man in my position has the authority to arrange." There it was, the hidden motive laid bare, the betrayal of every civil principle a judge was supposed to uphold. Caroline felt the cold move through her chest like creek water in February, but she kept her face still because she had been keeping her face still in front of men who wanted something from her since she was 19 years old. She was 27 now, 8 years of practice. "Are you suggesting," she said carefully, "that you would exercise your judicial authority to forgive a legitimate debt in exchange for my agreement to marry you?" He spread his hands as though she had said something unreasonable. "I'm suggesting that life in Harrow Creek can be either comfortable or uncomfortable for a woman alone. I'm suggesting that I am a man of means and standing who finds you exceptionally." "I understand what you are suggesting," Caroline said, "and my answer is no." She turned and walked out, and behind her she heard him call her name once loudly, the way men call the names of things they expect to come back when summoned. She did not come back. She walked down the front steps of the courthouse with her spine straight and her hands folded in front of her, and she walked 3 blocks to the general store that bore her family's name. The painted letters faded now, ATWOOD General Goods, and she went inside and locked the door behind her and stood in the dark for a long moment with her back against the wood. Her father had opened this store in 1869, 14 years ago, when Harrow Creek was barely a cattle trail and a well. Thomas Atwood had been a quiet man with an accountant's precision and a genuine love of good fabric, and he had built the store into something that kept the town fed and clothed and supplied through good years and drought years alike. He had died in February of this year from pneumonia that came too fast and left too little time for goodbyes, and he had left Caroline the store, and as it turned out, a debt to First Territorial Bank that she had not known existed. She was trying to work her way out of it honestly. She had been trying for 2 months. She kept the store open 6 days a week, and she managed the accounts herself, and she had even written to the bank directly to request a payment schedule that might let her stay afloat. The bank had not yet replied. What the bank had done instead, apparently, was give Judge Harlan Prout the power to ruin her or save her at his discretion, which was not something a bank should have the legal authority to do, and which suggested to Caroline that the arrangement between Prout and the bank was considerably less official than he had implied. She was standing in the dark sorting through these thoughts when the front window rattled. She startled, turned, and saw a face at the glass, but it was only old Mrs. Pemberton from the millinery shop next door, squinting in with her usual expression of concerned nosiness. Caroline unlocked the door and let her in. "I saw you coming down from the courthouse," Mrs. Pemberton said, sliding inside with the efficiency of a woman who has never once missed a piece of neighborhood news. "The judge again. The judge again," Caroline confirmed. And no, again." Mrs. Pemberton made a sound somewhere between approval and worry. She was 70 years old and had been in Harrow Creek since before there was a courthouse to have a judge in, and she had opinions about everything and kept none of them to herself, which Caroline generally found exhausting but occasionally found useful. "You know," Mrs. Pemberton said, settling herself on the stool beside the counter with the ease of someone who intended to stay a while, "there are people in this town who think you are peculiar for saying no so many times." "I know," Caroline said. "Mr. Whitfield, the banker from Austin who came through in December, very respectable man, you said no. He wanted a hostess for his parties, not a wife. And before him, Dr. Ellis. Dr. Ellis informed me on our second conversation that women's brains were structurally unsuited to financial reasoning. He said this while standing inside my store that I run myself." Mrs. Pemberton's mouth twitched. "And before him, Gerald Mace. Gerald Mace came to court me while his wife was visiting her sister in Laredo. He said they were separated. They were not." Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon rolled past, and the sound of hooves on packed dirt was the comfortable, rhythmic sound that formed the background of every day in Harrow Creek. Spring light came through the front window and made the dust motes visible, floating and slow. "The thing is, Mrs. Pemberton said finally, the judge has real power here. Whether his arrangement with the bank is legal or not, if he decides to make trouble for you, he can make a great deal of it." Caroline knew this. She had known it walking down those courthouse steps, and she knew it now, and the knowing of it was a cold, quiet weight in her chest that had been sitting there since February when she first opened her father's books and found the debt. "I'll find another way," she said. She meant it. She simply had no idea yet what that way was. That was 3 weeks before Dexter Ramsey rode into Harrow Creek. He came in from the west on a Tuesday afternoon, which was an unremarkable thing, because men on horseback came into Harrow Creek from every direction every day. What made Dexter Ramsey noticeable, if you happened to look up when his horse passed, was not the horse, which was a good quarter horse but not remarkable, and not the man's clothing, which was dusty and trail-worn and entirely ordinary for someone who had been riding a long distance in late spring heat. It was something harder to name, a quality of stillness in a man who was clearly moving, a way of sitting in the saddle that suggested he was paying equal attention to everything around him and making no particular show of doing so. Caroline noticed him because she was sweeping the front step when he rode past, and because he was the 6th person to pass going toward the livery stable in 20 minutes, and something about the spacing of him, the solitude, caught her attention briefly. He did not look at her. She went back to sweeping. She did not think about him again until the next morning, when the bell above her door rang at 8:15, and she looked up from the ledger she was reconciling to see a tall man in a clean shirt standing just inside the entrance. The shirt was clean, but everything else about him still carried the mark of the road. His boots were good quality but cracked at the seams. His hat had seen considerable weather. He was somewhere in his early 30s with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had recently been shaved, not this morning but recently, and his eyes, when they found hers, were a clear and direct gray that was not what she had expected. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for trail supplies. Flour, salt, dried beans if you have them, some coffee, cartridges for a Winchester if they're in stock." His voice was low and even and completely without the elaborate courtesy that men in Harrow Creek frequently deployed when speaking to Caroline, the exaggerated gallantry that always felt to her like a net being cast rather than a kindness being offered. "Flour's 50 cents for 10 pounds, she said, closing the ledger and standing. "Salt's a quarter, beans depend on how many pounds. Coffee is 18 cents a pound. Winchester cartridges, I have .4440 if that works. It works, he said. I'll take 10 pounds of flour, 5 of salt, 10 of beans, 2 pounds of coffee, and 2 boxes of cartridges. She got everything together while he stood near the door and looked at the shelves with the kind of patient, observational quiet that reminded her, oddly, of her father. Thomas Atwood had looked at things the same way, like he was actually interested in them rather than simply waiting to move on. She tallied the total, told him what it came to, and he paid in coin without commentary or negotiation. As she was wrapping the last bundle, he said, "You're the owner." "I am," she said. He nodded once, as though that answered a question he had not quite asked aloud. He gathered the supplies, tipped his hat in a way that was courteous without being theatrical, and left. That was it. That was all of it. She thought about his gray eyes for approximately 30 seconds after the bell above the door stopped swinging, then went back to her ledger. He came back that afternoon. She was helping Mrs. Donnelly select thread for a repair job when the bell rang again, and she looked up, and it was him. He stood near the door again as though he had not quite decided whether coming in had been a good idea, and he waited with the same quality of still patience until Mrs. Donnelly had chosen her thread and departed. Then he stepped forward to the counter. "I wondered," he said, and then he stopped, like a man who had rehearsed something and arrived to find that the rehearsed version didn't quite fit the actual moment. Caroline waited. He tried again. "I was told in town that you might be looking for someone to help with supply transport. I heard there was a freight issue, with the usual wagon man being laid up." That was true. Pete Garner, who did her larger deliveries from the rail depot 20 miles west, had broken his leg in March, and his replacement had proven unreliable. She had been managing with smaller loads and was falling behind on restocking several items. She looked at this man for a moment, actually looked at him, the way she looked at a ledger entry that needed verifying before she trusted it. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Man at the livery. Fellow named Calhoun." Old Billy Calhoun, who knew every piece of business in Harrow Creek and spoke freely about all of it. She was not surprised. "What's your name?" she said. "Dexter Ramsey." "Where are you from, Dexter Ramsey?" Something moved across his face at that. Not evasion exactly, but a careful sorting, like a man deciding which true things to say. "Kansas, originally. I've been riding with a cattle outfit out of New Mexico for the last 2 years, but the drive's done and I'm passing through looking for work." Kansas. New Mexico. A working cowboy between jobs. She had enough experience reading men to know that this was almost certainly exactly what he said it was, which did not mean it was all there was to know about him, but it meant he was not lying. "The job pays $1.50 a day plus meals when you're on the road," she said. "It involves driving to the rail depot at Birch Crossing, loading whatever's come in on the freight manifest and bringing it back intact. I've had breakage problems with the last man and I won't tolerate it. You'd need your own horse, but I provide the wagon for the road section." He nodded slowly. "When would the first run be?" "Thursday. There's a shipment of dry goods and hardware I've been waiting on since last week." "I'll do it," he said. She extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief and professional. "Be here at 6 Thursday morning," she said. He left again, and this time she watched the door for a few seconds longer before she went back to work, and she told herself that she was simply noting the details of a new business arrangement. That night, she sat at the desk in the back room of the store, which also served as her living quarters since she had given up the house on Maple Street after her father died, because the house was too large and too full of his absence to sleep in comfortably, and she went through the accounts again. The debt her father had accumulated with First Territorial Bank was $847. It was not an impossible amount, not for a store doing reasonable business, but it was large enough that clearing it in 60 days was going to require something close to a miracle of steady trade. She had the store. She had her father's reputation for honest dealing. She had her own intelligence and the organizational ability that had gotten her through 8 years of running the books while her father ran the floor. What she did not have was a margin for unexpected costs, a broken supply line being the most pressing example of that problem. Dexter Ramsey showed up at 6 on Thursday. She had expected he might be late, as the last man had been chronically late, or that he might show up with the smell of whiskey still on him, as the man before that had occasionally done. He was on the front step at 5:55, checked the horse's rigging with his own hands before hitching it to her wagon, loaded the empty crates with an efficiency that suggested he had done physical work for most of his life, and then stood waiting for her to hand over the freight manifest. She rode with him the first time. She told herself it was to show him the route, which was partly true. They drove 20 miles of Texas road in the growing warmth of a May morning, and for the first several miles they did not speak much beyond the practical. Here's where the road forks. The depot agent is named Morrison, and he can be slow, so push him gently. Watch the right rear wheel because it had a wobble last month that I had repaired, but I'm not fully confident. Somewhere around the midpoint in a flat stretch where the mesquite was sparse and the sky was entirely visible in all directions, he said, "How long have you run the store alone?" "Since February," she said. "My father died." "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the kind of simple that meant it. "He built it from nothing," she said, and she was surprised to hear herself saying more than she had intended to say. "He came here in 1869 with $40 and a set of scales and a belief that a place growing fast enough to need cattle drives also needed everything else. He was right about that." She paused. "He also borrowed more than I knew to get the stock levels he wanted in the last few years, which is something I'm working through now." Dexter Ramsey was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "Debt can do that," he said. "Creep up in the background while the front of things looks fine." "Yes," she said, "it can." That was all either of them said on that subject. But something had shifted slightly in the space between them on the wagon seat, something that had been formal and transactional, and was now just a fraction less so, which Caroline noticed and filed away the way she filed away everything that seemed potentially important. The freight run took all day. They returned to Harrow Creek at 6:30 in the evening with a full load secured without breakage, which was already an improvement. Dexter unhitched the horse and saw to it himself without being asked, then loaded the crates into the back storeroom of the shop with a methodical care that she appreciated. She paid him at the end of the day the agreed $1.50 plus a plate of cold supper from her own kitchen, because they hadn't stopped to eat and she had bread and cheese and cold beans, and it seemed discourteous not to offer it. He accepted the food with evident gratitude and no elaborate performance of gratitude, which she also appreciated. He came back the following Thursday for the next run, and the Thursday after that. And gradually, the runs became something she looked forward to in a way that she examined carefully in the privacy of her own thoughts and did not allow herself to name too quickly. Meanwhile, Judge Pruitt had not accepted her refusal with the finality she had intended it to convey. He sent a letter to the store in the third week of May, addressed formally and sealed with his official seal, which was, she recognized, deliberately intimidating. The letter was phrased with legal courtesy and said, between its careful lines, that the bank had moved up the deadline on the debt and that she now had 40 days rather than 60 to address it, which coincidentally was not possible on the current trajectory of the store's income, and that he remained, as he put it, disposed toward an amicable resolution of her difficulties. Caroline read the letter twice, folded it precisely, and put it in the drawer with the account books. She then wrote a letter to the bank in Austin directly, bypassing Pruitt entirely, asking for documentation of the deadline change and for a copy of the original debt agreement. She was fairly certain the deadline change was fabricated, or at least exaggerated, and she was equally certain that Pruitt had not anticipated her going around him to verify it. Men who set traps rarely expect the prey to walk calmly back to examine the mechanism. It was on the fourth freight run, late in May, that she told Dexter about the judge. They were eating at a roadside stop, a flat rock near a stand of cottonwoods where the horses could rest in shade, and she had packed better food this time, cornbread and cold roast chicken and 2 apples, and the day was pleasant in that specific early summer way that makes everything in Texas look kinder than it usually is. She did not plan to tell him. She had not told anyone except Mrs. Pemberton, and telling Mrs. Pemberton was approximately equivalent to telling the town, which she had accepted because Mrs. Pemberton had experience and connections, and sometimes that mattered. But she was talking about the accounts, as she sometimes did on these rides, because Dexter listened without interruption and without offering unsolicited advice, and she found herself saying, "There's also the matter of the judge, which makes all of this considerably more complicated." Dexter looked at her. She told him. She was precise about it, as she was precise about everything, laying out the facts in order. The debt, Pruitt's position as the bank's local representative, the offer he had made, her refusal, the letter about the changed deadline, her response of going directly to the bank. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted through an apple's worth of time. "What do you know about this man?" Dexter said. His voice had changed very slightly. Not loudly, not dramatically, but there was something quieter in it and somehow more present. "He's been judge in Harrow Creek for 6 years," she said. "Appointed by the county, not elected. He's a widower. He has money from somewhere that isn't entirely accounted for by a judge's salary. He's not violent, as far as I know. He's the kind of man who does damage with paper and procedure, not with his fists." Dexter was quiet again. He turned one of the apple cores over in his fingers. "That can be harder to fight," he said. "I know. Have you talked to a lawyer?" "The only lawyer in Harrow Creek is Pruitt's cousin," she said. "The nearest independent counsel is in Millhaven, which is 40 miles. I've written to them. I'm waiting for a response." He nodded once. The quality of his listening was different now from how it had been on the first runs, less the polite attention of an employee and more the focused attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand. She noticed that. She noticed it, and then she firmly looked at the cottonwood trees for a moment to give herself somewhere to put the feeling. They drove back to Harrow Creek with the load, and she paid him, and he went toward the livery where he rented a room above the stalls, and she went inside and did not allow herself to stand at the window watching him walk away. She did not quite succeed at that, but she only watched for a moment. The response from the bank in Austin came on the 2nd of June. It was not what she had hoped for and better than she had feared. The bank confirmed that the original debt agreement was legitimate and that the deadline was 90 days from the date of her father's death in February, which made it the first week of May. It was already past. She was already technically in default. However, the bank's letter also noted that the assignment of local authority to Judge Pruitt had been a temporary administrative measure, and that the Austin office was reviewing all such local arrangements. It said nothing definitive, but the tone of it suggested that someone in Austin was not entirely comfortable with whatever arrangement Pruitt had made. She was sitting with this letter at the front counter on a Thursday morning, the store not yet open, working through what it meant, when a knock at the front door startled her. It was Dexter. He was earlier than usual, which she registered, and there was something about his posture at the door that was different from the easy, patient way he usually arrived. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision and was not entirely sure it was the right one but was going to go through with it anyway. She unlocked the door. "I know I'm early," he said. "I wanted to talk to you before the day started, if that's all right." She held the door open. He came in. He stood near the counter and turned his hat in his hands once, twice, and then set it on the counter and looked at her directly with those clear gray eyes. "I've been thinking about the situation with the judge," he said. "And I want to tell you something that I probably should have said earlier, or maybe I shouldn't say it at all, and I've been going back and forth on that, but I think you should know." She waited. "I know something about Harlan Pruitt," he said. "Not from here, from before here." He paused, and she could see him choosing words carefully. 2 years ago, I was working a cattle drive that passed through a town called Red Bluff, which is about 120 miles west of here. There was a man there named Prout who was operating as a land agent. He was involved in a scheme to falsify deed records for land that homesteaders had already paid for, then resell it to a railroad company. 3 families lost their properties. The thing is, I don't know with certainty that it was the same man, but the name is unusual, and the description matches, and the method using paperwork and legal authority to take things from people who can't easily fight back sounds exactly like what you're describing. Caroline looked at him. "Did anyone report it?" she asked. "One family tried. The local marshal was connected to the scheme. The county sheriff investigated and found insufficient evidence, which I believe is different from no evidence." He paused again. "I didn't report it myself. I was a working cowhand passing through, and I didn't know if my word would count for anything against a man with legal credentials, and I've thought about that since then." There was something in his voice when he said the last part that was honest about regret in a way that did not ask for absolution. Caroline was very still. "Would you be willing to write down what you know?" she said. "In a statement, signed and dated." "Yes," he said. "That's why I came to tell you. I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't." She studied him for a long moment. She was looking for the hidden motive, the angle she hadn't seen yet, the thing underneath the offered help that would turn out to be a different kind of trap. She was practiced at that looking. She had gotten good at it. She did not find one. "All right," she said. "Sit down. I have paper and ink." He sat at her counter, and she got the paper and ink and set them in front of him, and he wrote out in a steady, clear hand everything he knew about Harlan Prout and the land scheme in Red Bluff. He wrote for about 20 minutes. His handwriting was better than she expected, not elegant but precise, each letter fully formed, and the account he wrote was specific and organized and avoided the emotional language that made statements easy to dismiss. When he was done, she read it over. "You can write," she said. "My mother was a school teacher," he said, and something about the way he said it suggested that this was not a small thing. She added the statement to the folder with the bank's letter and the judge's original note and the copy of the debt agreement her father had signed. Then she looked at the folder for a moment and made a decision. "I'm going to ride to Millhaven today," she said. "Not Thursday, today. The lawyer I wrote to, his name is James Calloway, and he's responded to my letter and said he can see me. I wasn't planning to go until next week, but I think this statement changes the timing." She looked at Dexter. "I'd be grateful if you would come with me, not as an employee." As she paused, looking for the right word that was honest without being more than she was prepared to say yet, as the person who wrote the statement in case Calloway has questions. "I'll come," Dexter said. He said it without hesitation and without the kind of elaborate willingness that would have felt performative. He simply said it, the way he did most things, directly and without decoration. They took the wagon. It was a full day's travel to Millhaven and another day back, which meant spending a night on the road, and Caroline arranged for Mrs. Pemberton to keep an eye on the store, and she packed food and the folder of documents and a blanket in case the temperature dropped, which in June it usually did not, but she was a person who prepared for variables. The road to Millhaven ran through open country that was not quite flat and not quite hilly, a kind of rolling landscape that was specific to this part of central Texas, and the sky was extremely large above it. They left at dawn and reached Millhaven by early afternoon. James Calloway was a careful man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of meticulous office that told you he took his work seriously. He read through everything Caroline had brought, including Dexter's statement, with the same careful attention she had given it, and then he set the folder on his desk and took his spectacles off and looked at them both. "Miss Atwood," he said, "the situation with the debt deadline is legally significant. What the bank's letter confirms is that the deadline has already passed, which means you are in default, which means legally the bank could move to claim the property now. However, the bank's tone suggests they are not rushing to do that, which means they are either uncertain about the Prout arrangement or they are waiting on something. The review of local arrangements they mentioned, Caroline said. Precisely. That language is protective language. It means someone in the Austin office is uncomfortable and is building a record before deciding what to do. He tapped the folder. This statement about Red Bluff changes things considerably. If we can connect the Harlan Prout in Red Bluff to the Judge Harlan Prout in Harrow Creek, and if the Red Bluff matter can be corroborated, it becomes a pattern of behavior that the county could not responsibly ignore. It also gives the bank in Austin a legal reason to distance themselves from Prout's local authority arrangement, which they would very much like to have. Can we connect them? Caroline asked. I'll need to make inquiries. I have a colleague in the western counties who may have records. Calloway looked at Dexter. Mr. Ramsey, would you be willing to provide testimony if this goes before a county inquiry? Yes, Dexter said. Calloway nodded. Then here is what I recommend. You return to Harrow Creek. You continue operating the store. You do not respond to the judge's communications without routing them through me, and you give me 2 weeks to make inquiries. In the meantime, I'll draft a response to the Austin Bank on your behalf that acknowledges the default status while presenting grounds for a formal extension pending investigation. Banks in Austin are not eager to become associated with judicial misconduct. That letter alone may buy you the time you need. Caroline felt something ease in her chest that she had been holding tight since February. It was not relief exactly, because the problem was not yet solved, but it was the feeling of having moved from a position of isolated resistance to a position where there were pieces on the board that could be moved. She thanked James Calloway, paid his initial consultation fee in coin that she had set aside for this purpose, and they left his office as the afternoon light was going golden and long. They made camp outside Millhaven on the road back, because the evening came faster than they had planned due to the length of the meeting. It was a simple camp, a small fire, the horses picketed on a long rope to a mesquite tree, the blanket Caroline had brought divided between them against the cool that came after the heat. They ate cornbread and dried beef, and the last of the coffee from the morning's pot that she had sealed in a jar. The fire made the darkness beyond it very dark and the stars above it very close, and after a while, in the way of firelight, the silence between them became comfortable rather than empty. Can I ask you something? Caroline said. Yes, he said. Why are you between jobs, the cattle outfit in New Mexico? Why did you leave it? He looked at the fire for a moment. I was with the Barker outfit for 2 years, he said. Good outfit, solid work. But the owner, Ben Barker, he sold the company to a land speculation group out of Denver last winter. When the new owners came in, they changed the operation. They started cutting corners on how the cattle were handled on the trail, not cruel exactly, but close. And they were skimming wages on the Mexican hands, paying them less than the agreed rate, banking on the fact that they had no legal recourse in a territory where the courts were not friendly to them. He paused. I said something about both things. The foreman told me the new owner's policies weren't negotiable, so I left. Caroline turned this over quietly. That must have cost you, she said. It cost me a regular wage, he said, which matters, but there are some trades I've found I'm not able to make. She thought about that for a while. The fire crackled. One of the horses shifted and settled. My father was like that, she said. He extended credit to families who couldn't pay it back through drought years, when it would have made more financial sense not to. He said the store existed because the town existed, and that you couldn't separate those two things and make either one right. He sounds like a good man, Dexter said. He was, she said, and the simplicity of using the past tense hurt the way it still occasionally did, a clean, quick cut. There was a pause, and then Dexter said, Caroline, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal miss attached to it. She noted this with the same careful attention she applied to everything. What? She said. He turned and looked at her from across the small fire, and his face in the firelight was doing something that was not quite the careful neutral of their daytime conversations, and she thought, with a lurch of recognition that she had been, if she was being honest with herself, expecting this for at least 2 weeks. Here it comes. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to be clear that the answer I get doesn't change anything about the other matters. The freight runs, the situation with Prout, none of that is conditional on how you answer." She looked at him steadily. "Ask." "I'd like to spend more time with you," he said. "Not as your employee. I'd like to come calling. Formally, if that's the word. I know you have a great deal on your plate right now, and I know I'm a man passing through who hasn't given you much reason to trust that staying is something I'm inclined to do, and I'm asking anyway because not asking seems like the wrong choice." The fire crackled. An owl called from somewhere in the dark beyond the mesquite. Caroline looked at this man across the fire. This dusty, plain-spoken, honest man who had walked into her store 3 weeks ago and paid coin for his flour, and worked reliably every Thursday, and told her about Red Bluff, because he thought she needed to know, and had not once tried to make himself indispensable or impressive or necessary. And she thought about the gentleman who had wanted a hostess, and the merchant who had wanted a bookkeeper, and the judge who had wanted a possession. And she thought about how different this felt from all of those. "All right," she said. He blinked, just slightly, like a man who had prepared for a more complicated conversation. "All right," he repeated. "Yes," she clarified. "You can come calling." She looked back at the fire. "I should tell you that I'm not easy company. I'm direct and I keep my own counsel and I have opinions about things that some men find tiresome." "I've noticed all of that," he said. "I haven't found any of it tiresome." She heard something in that was genuine and not constructed for her benefit, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to let the warmth of the fire and the dark and the wide sky above them be exactly what it was without analyzing it any further. They reached Harrow Creek the next evening and resumed their ordinary routines, which were now slightly different without being visibly different, if you were not paying close attention. He did come calling. He came to the store on a Sunday, which was the one day she closed, and he brought 2 bottles of soda water from the pharmacy because he had observed at some point that she had a weakness for soda water, and they sat on the porch in the late afternoon sun and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with freight manifests or legal proceedings, about Kansas and Texas, and what the country looked like from different angles of movement through it. About her mother who had died when Caroline was 12, and whom she still thought about with a sharp and specific grief. About his father who had been a difficult man, and his mother who had been a steady one. About books, because it turned out they had both read more than the average person in their respective circumstances, which surprised them both enough to keep them going on that subject for a long time. When he left at the edge of evening, she stood at the porch railing and watched him walk toward the livery, and she did not make even a small attempt to look away, and she thought about the way he had said her name across the fire, and felt something warm move through her chest that she was no longer pretending to herself was anything other than what it was. She was falling in love with this dusty, honest, careful man, and the thought did not frighten her the way she might have expected it to. What it felt like was something solid, like ground under her feet after a long time of standing on something that shifted. James Calloway wrote to her at the end of June. His inquiries had confirmed it. The Harlan Prout who had operated as a land agent in Red Bluff in 1881 was the same man who had been appointed to the judgeship in Harrow Creek the following year. Calloway's colleague in the western counties had records of the Red Bluff complaints, filed but never properly investigated, and those records included names of witnesses, including 2 of the affected homesteaders who were still alive and still in the region and willing to provide statements. More importantly, Calloway had submitted his response letter to the Austin Bank, and the bank's reply had come back within 2 weeks, which was very fast for a bank, and indicated, as Calloway put it, that they were highly motivated to move quickly. The bank had agreed to a formal extension of the debt deadline pending review, and had simultaneously notified the county that they were suspending Pruitt's local authority arrangement effective immediately pending that same review. Pruitt did not take this quietly. He came to the store on a Wednesday morning, the first week of July, and he was not smiling this time. He was a man who had felt the ground shifting under his own feet and who was, Caroline recognized, frightened, which made him more dangerous rather than less. He came in when the store was full of customers, 4 women doing their weekly shopping and old Mr. Hendricks at the back looking at hardware, and he stood at the counter and spoke in a low, controlled voice that was meant to be private but was not in a store that size. "You have made a serious mistake," he said, "going around me to the Austin office. Whatever story you've been telling people about my character, I assure you that the legal authority in this county rests with Judge Pruitt," Caroline said, at full volume, pleasant and clear and completely unrattled. "I would be happy to discuss the matter of the First Territorial Bank debt with you at a scheduled meeting that includes my legal counsel, Mr. James Calloway of Millhaven. If you'd like to arrange that meeting, I suggest you write to him directly." She held his gaze. "I'm currently serving customers. Is there something I can help you purchase?" The 4 women at the shelves had gone extremely still in the manner of people who are absolutely listening, while making every effort to appear not to be. Old Mr. Hendricks had turned away from the hardware with the expression of a man who had just been provided excellent entertainment. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I expect not. Good morning, Judge." He left. The bell above the door rang with a specific finality. Mrs. Donnelly, who was one of the 4 women, said into the resulting silence, "Well done, dear." And the other 3 made sounds of agreement, and everyone went back to their shopping as though nothing particular had happened, which was, Caroline thought, the most gracious response she could have hoped for. Dexter was at the store that evening, having come to help unload a delivery that had arrived unexpectedly large, and she told him about the visit. He listened, and then he said, "He's scared now. Scared men do things that careful men don't. Are you safe here?" It was a practical question, and he asked it practically, not as a prelude to offering to move in and guard her, which some men would have used as the excuse to do. He was asking because he wanted to know what the actual risk level was. She thought about it honestly. "He's not a violent man," she said. "His methods are legal and procedural. The moment he does something physical, he loses everything, and he's intelligent enough to know that. His move right now is probably to try to discredit me somehow, spread something around town that makes me look unreliable or immoral." She paused. "He may try to use you to do that." Dexter looked at her. "He could claim," she said carefully, "that there is something improper in our arrangement, a woman alone with a hired man traveling together. In a town where he has influence over how things are interpreted." A beat of silence. "Is that going to be a problem for you?" he asked. "If he does that, it might make things uncomfortable," she said. "It won't change what I'm doing." He nodded once. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly so there's no confusion about what I mean." He looked at her directly. "I think you're the most capable and honest person I've met in a long time, and I'm in love with you, which I recognize is either the right time to say or completely the wrong time, depending on how you look at it, given everything that's happening. But I wanted you to know it so that if Pruitt does try to make something out of our association, at least the thing he's implying has the dignity of being real." The store was empty except for them. The evening light came through the west window and made everything on the shelves warm and golden. Caroline looked at Dexter Ramsey and thought about all the times in 8 years she had looked at a man who was saying something with a different thing underneath it, and she thought about how this felt nothing like any of those times, and she thought about her father who had said you couldn't separate a thing from the ground it grew in and still call either one right. "I love you too," she said. "Which I recognize is also possibly bad timing." He was quiet for just a second, and then he smiled, and it was not a performance and it was not theatrical. It was just a man with a real feeling that had just received a real answer, and it looked like relief and joy together, and it was the most straightforward and beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You already asked me something," she said, "earlier this month. This is a different something." She waited. "When this is settled," he said, "the thing with Prout and the bank, when it's done, I'd like to ask you to marry me. I'm not asking now because I think you have enough on your plate and I don't want it tangled up with everything else. But I wanted to tell you that it's what I'm going to ask, so you have time to think about it and give me an honest answer when the time comes." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is the most sensible and also strangest proposal I have ever received. Is that good or bad?" "It's very you," she said, "which is good." He looked at her for a moment with that clear gray gaze, and then he said, "All right, I'll wait for the timing." "Dexter," she said. "Yes." "You can kiss me," she said. "The timing is fine for that." He crossed the room in 2 steps and kissed her, and it was quiet and certain and exactly what it was, which was 2 people who had been moving toward each other for weeks finally arriving. And outside on the main street of Harrow Creek, the ordinary sounds of an early July evening continued without noticing that something had just changed in the world. The inquiry into Judge Harlan Prout was formally opened by the county on the 15th of July, 1883. It was triggered by 3 things arriving in the county seat within the same week: James Calloway's letter on Caroline's behalf, a formal complaint from one of the Red Bluff homesteaders who had been located and who had been waiting for precisely this kind of opening for 2 years, and a quiet communication from First Territorial Bank indicating that they had concerns about the legality of Prout's local authority arrangement. Prout, when notified, did exactly what Caroline had predicted. He attempted to muddy the waters. He made statements around town that were designed to cast doubt on the integrity of Caroline's account of their conversations, implying she had misunderstood the nature of his offer, that she had been hysterical in her response. He also made reference, obliquely, to the impropriety of a woman of property spending time, unchaperoned with a hired man she had known only a few weeks. The town of Harrow Creek, which had been watching quietly, responded in the way small towns sometimes respond to injustice when given enough clarity about what the injustice actually is. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been holding her opinions in careful reserve, began holding them in considerably less reserve. Mrs. Donnelly and the other women who had been in the store during Prout's visit told people what they had witnessed. Old Mr. Hendricks told everyone who came into his hardware shop the story in his own version, which was not entirely accurate but whose essential sympathies were correct. By the end of July, Harlow Creek's opinion of Judge Harlan Prout had shifted from cautious deference to something considerably colder. Prout left town on the 3rd of August. He did not leave dramatically. He did not flee under cover of night. He packed his effects over a period of 3 days and rode out on a Wednesday morning with a hired wagon, and did not say goodbye to anyone and did not look back, which was, in its way, its own kind of answer. The formal inquiry continued in his absence, but without him in town, its relevance to the immediate situation of Harrow Creek was administrative rather than urgent. James Calloway informed Caroline in a letter dated the 5th of August that the bank in Austin had agreed to honor the original debt timeline, meaning the additional pressure had been illegitimate, and had further agreed, given the circumstances, to extend a new payment schedule over 18 months at a reduced interest rate. This was manageable, more than manageable. This was survivable. She read that letter at the front counter of Atwood General Goods on a warm August morning with the door open and the street smelling of dust and horses and the particular dry sweetness of Texas summer, and she folded it as carefully as she had folded the judge's threatening letter and put it in the drawer, but this time she was smiling when she did it. Dexter came to the store that afternoon, not for freight, just to come. He did that now on the days he wasn't working, and she had stopped pretending she wasn't expecting him. She showed him the letter. He read it. His face did the thing it did when he was genuinely pleased about something but was too controlled to express it loudly, which was a slight relaxation around the eyes and the corners of the mouth. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. There was a pause. "Is the timing right now?" he said. He said it simply, no performance, no elaborate lead-up. She looked at him. "You said you'd ask when the thing with Prout and the bank was settled," she said. "It's settled," he said. "It is," she agreed. He took a breath. "Caroline Atwood, will you marry me?" She had had 8 years of suitors and proposals and requests and pressures and traps and arrangements that presented themselves as proposals, and she had turned every single one of them down. And standing here in her father's store, with the August light coming through the open door and this honest, quiet, difficult man looking at her with his whole heart evident in his gray eyes, the answer came without any weight attached to it at all. "Yes," she said. He stepped forward and took both her hands, and she could feel that he was not entirely steady, which was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him and which she loved. And she held his hands and looked up at him and felt completely sure. They were married on the first Saturday of September, 1883, in the white church on the corner of Main and Elm, which was modest and hot even in September, and entirely full because the town of Harrow Creek had decided to attend in force. Mrs. Pemberton cried loudly in the front pew and was unashamed about it. Old Mr. Hendricks stood in the back and nodded with satisfaction throughout, as though this outcome were something he had personally arranged. Caroline wore her mother's dress, which she had spent 2 weeks quietly altering to fit, because her mother had been smaller in the shoulders, and the style was 30 years old, but the fabric was good ivory silk, and the cut was clean and honest, and she thought her father would have approved of both the dress and the man. Dexter wore his best clothes, which were still considerably trail-worn by most people's standards, but he had gotten his hair cut, and the boots were polished, and there was something about the way he stood at the altar that was entirely without performance, just a man standing in a significant moment, and not trying to be anything other than what he was. The minister spoke the words. They spoke their words back, and when it was done and they were walking out into the September morning, Harrow Creek in its ordinary morning noise of wagons and horses and people going about their business, Caroline thought about how a year ago she had been standing in the dark of this same store against a closed door, certain that the road ahead was going to be nothing but solitary, exhausting, lonely navigation. She had been wrong about that. She was glad. They had a small celebration in the afternoon at Mrs. Pemberton's house, which was large enough for the 20-odd friends and neighbors who came, and there was food and a fiddle player who turned out to be far better than anyone had expected, and dancing in the parlor that spread out onto the front porch. And at one point, Dexter took her hand, and they danced a reel that she had not danced since her mother's time, and she could not stop laughing at the way he counted the steps under his breath. And the laughing felt like something that had been waiting a long time to get out. The first year of their marriage was a working year, in the way that most things in a person's life have to be worked at before they become easy. The store's debt was on the 18-month schedule Calloway had negotiated, and they made every payment on time, and Dexter's freight work became a formalized part of the store's operation rather than a temporary arrangement. He was good at all of it, reliable and honest and perceptive about supply and demand in ways that turned out to complement how Caroline managed the books. And by the spring of 1884, the store was doing better than it had done in several years. Dexter was also, it turned out, someone who had more skills than the specific ones he had mentioned when she hired him. He could build things. He built new shelving for the back storeroom that added 20% more storage capacity. He repaired the roof on the building before winter hit it, and the repair held perfectly. He replaced the failing wheel on the delivery wagon with such precision that she never had another wobble problem. He was also someone who had secrets, not harmful ones, not the kind that hid a darker nature, but the kind that lived in a person's history and came out slowly in the way real things do. She learned about his father gradually, a man who had been given to extended silences and occasional harsh moods, and about how Dexter had left Kansas at 18 with a working knowledge of cattle and a determination not to repeat the patterns he had grown up inside. She learned that he was a person who wrote letters, careful and regular ones, to his mother in Kansas, and that his mother's letters back were among the things he treated most carefully. She learned that he was capable of real anger, but had an internal mechanism for it that turned the heat down before it came out as something destructive, and that this mechanism had clearly been deliberately built and was not something that had come naturally, and she admired the building of it. She was not herself easy. She had said so and meant it. She had opinions about nearly everything and expressed them without apology. She had a way of working through problems in her head before she would voice them, which meant that sometimes she was quiet in ways that could look like distance when it was really just process. She did not cry easily, and when she did, it surprised both of them. She was frugal in ways that occasionally frustrated him when he thought she was being frugal about things that didn't need it, which led to at least 2 arguments in that first year that were actually about communication and not about the things they said they were about. They worked through all of it. That was the thing about them, she came to understand. They were both people who worked through things rather than leaving them unresolved, and when they disagreed, they came back to each other with the same honesty they brought to everything else, and the honesty made it possible to disagree without it becoming a wound. In the autumn of 1884, she told him she was expecting. She had taken 2 weeks to be certain before she said anything, and then she told him on a Sunday evening on the back porch of the house they had rented on Maple Street, which was smaller than the house her father had lived in but suited them, with a good kitchen and a yard that got morning light. He went very still in the way he went still when something was real and large, and then he stood up from his chair and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she could feel the feeling in him, relief and joy and terror all together, which was, she thought, probably appropriate to the situation. He said, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "I expect I will continue to be fine." "Right," he said, and then, "Caroline, what? I'm going to be somebody's father." "Yes," she said. "I want to do it differently than mine," he said. She held him back firmly. "You already are," she said. The baby was born on the 14th of May, 1885, a boy which surprised exactly no one who had been keeping their own private predictions, though it surprised Caroline, who had somewhere in the back of her mind expected a girl. They named him Thomas, after her father, and he was a loud and emphatic child from his first moment, with Caroline's dark eyes and Dexter's stubborn quality of attention, and they were both entirely overwhelmed by him in the way new parents are overwhelmed, completely and without adequate preparation, and in a way that is nothing like anyone told you it would be. By the time Thomas was 3 months old and sleeping in longer stretches, they had found their footing with him, the same way they had found their footing with each other, through work and honesty and the willingness to say when something wasn't working. The debt to First Territorial Bank was paid in full in November of 1885, 11 months ahead of the schedule, because the store had had 2 excellent years. Caroline stood in the store on the morning the final payment went out and looked at the zero balance she had written in the ledger, clean and final and permanent. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she was learning to think about him. Not with the sharp grief of the first year, but with something warmer and more complicated. A person who had built something real and passed it on, and who had also been imperfect and human about some of it, and whom she loved without needing him to have been different than he was. She wrote his name in the margin next to the zero. Thomas Atwood, just that. The inquiry into Judge Harlan Prout concluded in 1886. He was found to have engaged in an improper arrangement with First Territorial Bank and to have used judicial authority for personal gain in the matter of Caroline's debt. He was formally stripped of his judgeship and barred from serving in any judicial or legal capacity in the state of Texas. The Red Bluff matter was taken up separately, And while a criminal conviction proved difficult to achieve due to elapsed time and the death of one key witness, the formal determination that misconduct had occurred was entered into the state record, which meant the families he had wronged at least had that. Dexter's testimony was part of the record that made the Red Bluff determination possible. James Calloway wrote to tell them when it was concluded, and Dexter read the letter at breakfast and set it down and didn't say much. But Caroline could see what it meant to him. The thing he'd said on the road to Millhaven about not having spoken up in Red Bluff and thinking about it since then. The matter was closed now. Not perfectly, not fully, but closed enough to matter. Life in Harrow Creek in the late 1880s was the kind of life that is made of the ordinary in ways that turn out, when you look back on them, to have been everything. Thomas grew into a child who was curious about every single thing in the store with an intensity that was occasionally exhausting and frequently wonderful. Dexter, who had never considered himself much of a settled-down man, turned out to be exceptionally good at the daily business of being settled down, in the particular way that people who have spent a long time in motion understand the value of staying still. He planted a kitchen garden behind the house in the spring of 1886, tomatoes and squash and 3 varieties of beans, and he tended it with the same careful attention he gave to everything. And the summer they had fresh tomatoes for the first time. Caroline ate them warm off the vine standing in the garden, and thought that there were small perfect things in the world that cost nothing and meant everything. They had a second child in 1887. A girl this time, with Dexter's gray eyes and Caroline's capacity for calm decision, and they named her Margaret, after Dexter's mother in Kansas, which made his mother cry happy tears in the letter she sent back when she received the news. She had not yet met them, the distance being what it was, but she wrote regular letters and Caroline had come to know her through them, a practical and warm and intelligent woman, and she understood Dexter better through understanding his mother. In the spring of 1888, when Margaret was 7 months old and Thomas was nearly 3, Dexter's mother came to Harrow Creek. Her name was Ruth Ramsey, and she was 62 years old, and she had the look of a woman who had done hard things with her own hands for a long time and did not consider this remarkable. She came on the train to Birch Crossing and Dexter drove out to collect her. And when the wagon came up the main street of Harrow Creek and Caroline was standing on the front step of the store with Thomas on her hip and Margaret in the crook of her arm, Ruth Ramsey climbed down from the wagon seat before it had quite stopped and walked directly to Caroline and looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were unmistakably the same clear gray as her son's. "He wrote to me about you," Ruth said. "Every letter for the last 4 years. All good things, I hope," Caroline said. "Nothing but true things," Ruth said, which turned out to be good. She looked at Thomas, and then at Margaret, and her face did something extraordinary and simple, the face of a grandmother meeting her grandchildren for the first time, which needs no description because it is completely itself. She stayed for 6 weeks. She and Caroline found each other almost immediately, which was not a surprise to either of them because they had been finding each other through letters for years, and the person in real life turned out to be recognizable from the correspondence. They talked about everything, the store and the debt and Prute and Dexter's childhood and Thomas Atwood, and what Harrow Creek had been and what it was becoming. Ruth told her, on the 2nd week of her visit, a thing that Dexter had never told her, or perhaps had told her in pieces without the full shape of it. When Dexter had been 17, his father had been approached by a man from the railroad who wanted to buy the family's land for far less than its value, and had manufactured pressure to make the sale feel necessary. Dexter had been the one to go to the county office himself and look up the actual land records and come back with the information that proved the deal was fraudulent, and the railroad man had left and the land had stayed. He had been a boy of 17 and he had known how to fight something wrong with information rather than with fists because his mother had taught him that. He was always going to be someone who couldn't let injustice sit unchallenged, Ruth said. It's not always comfortable to be that person, but I hoped he'd find someone who understood it. Caroline looked at her across the kitchen table. He found me, she said. Ruth smiled, small and genuine. Yes, he did. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no years are. There was a drought in 1889 that hit Harrow Creek hard and tested the store's margins again. Though with no debt and a stronger financial position than her father had built to, Caroline navigated it by careful buying and extending credit to families who needed it, the way her father had done, and the store came out of the drought year leaner but intact. There was a sickness that went through town in the winter of 1890, the kind that got into lungs and was worst in children, and Thomas had a bad week with it that terrified them both in the particular specific terror of a parent watching a sick child. He came through it. They sat up with him through 3 nights and he came through it, and the relief afterward was so enormous it was almost physical. Thomas Atwood Ramsey grew up to be, by the time he was 5 or 6, a boy with his grandfather's precision about numbers and his mother's directness, and his father's quality of paying attention to things that most people walked past without seeing. He was already helping Caroline with the store's simplest accounts by the time he was 8, not because she made him, but because he wanted to understand how it worked. Margaret Ramsey grew into a child who was interested primarily in growing things and in questions about how they grew, and she spent more time in the kitchen garden with her father than anywhere else. And by the time she was 5, she knew the names of everything in it and had opinions about which varieties did best in the clay-heavy soil behind the house on Maple Street. Dexter, in the spring of 1891, built a larger addition to the storage area of the store without being asked, having noticed that the growth in stock was straining the existing space. He drafted the plans himself and sourced the materials at a cost that was under what a contractor would have charged, and he built it over 6 weeks on the days he wasn't doing freight runs, which had expanded to 3 days a week as the store's needs grew. When it was done, Caroline walked through the new space and ran her hand along the shelving he had installed and said, "This is good work," which was not something she said lightly, and he knew it. "I had a good reason to do it well," he said. "The store." She said, "You," he said, "but also the store." She turned and looked at him in the new storage room with the afternoon light coming through the small high window he had put in to give the space ventilation. And she thought about a Tuesday afternoon 8 years ago, when a dusty stranger had walked into this store and asked for flour and salt and dried beans and cartridges and paid in coin and left, and then came back in the afternoon and had to start a sentence twice before the words came right. She walked up to him and kissed him, which she could do now without it being a surprise to either of them, but which was still, somehow each time, a thing that felt exactly like what it was, like choosing. Like a thing that was chosen freely every time. "Come on," she said, "I have supper to start." He followed her through the back of the store and out into the alley between the building and the next, and they walked together in the slanted evening light of a Texas spring. And somewhere in the house on Maple Street, Margaret was probably pulling things out of the vegetable patch to look at the roots, and Thomas was probably doing arithmetic at the kitchen table and waiting to ask someone a question. And the town around them had the sound of itself. Horses and hammers and voices, and the distant whistle of the evening freight train from the west, and it was ordinary and complete and entirely real. The store would do another 20 years of good business. Thomas would one day take over the accounts with the same precision Caroline had brought to them, and his grandfather had brought to them before her. Margaret would grow up to study agriculture at a women's college in San Antonio and come back to Harrow Creek with knowledge that she applied first to the family garden and eventually to helping half the county understand soil management in a way that changed what grew and what survived in that corner of Texas. But those were futures that would come in their own time. What existed now was this: an evening in spring, the store stocked and the debt paid and the people who had tried to take things away long gone, A man and a woman walking home together through the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a life built on honest ground. Dexter Ramsey had asked twice. He had asked to come calling, and she had said yes. He had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes. Both times the asking had been quiet and direct, and without the performance and pressure that she had learned to see through in 8 years of saying no to men who wanted her for reasons that had nothing to do with her. He had wanted her, just her. Not the store, not the social position, not a hostess or a bookkeeper or a possession. He had wanted to be near her, and she had felt the difference immediately, and the feeling had not lied. Caroline Atwood had turned down gentlemen and merchants and a judge, and she had not regretted any of the turning down, not once. She had been waiting, though she had not known she was waiting, for someone who would ask the right question, which was not what she could do for them or what she could be for them, but simply whether she wanted to be with him. She had wanted to be with him. She still did. On the night of their 9th wedding anniversary, September 1892, they sat on the back porch of the house on Maple Street after the children were in bed, and it was warm and the sky was entirely full of stars, and she had a glass of cold lemonade, and he had coffee, and they sat in easy, comfortable quiet. That was not empty silence, but the fullness of two people who had been talking to each other honestly for 9 years, and did not need to fill every moment with more words. After a while he said, "I never thought I'd be someone who had all this." "All what?" she said. "This," he said, not pointing at anything particular, just the word meaning all of it. The house and the store and the children asleep inside and the garden growing in the dark and the town around them and her, next to him, in the particular way she had always been next to him since the first freight run, present and complete and entirely herself. "Neither did I," she said honestly. He looked at her sidelong. "Are you glad?" She looked back at him across the years of it, the difficult first months and the legal fight and the nights on the road and the fire in the dark and him saying her name for the first time without the formal miss, and Thomas's birth and Margaret's eyes the first time she opened them, and the debt paid to zero and the name written in the margin, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days between and since. "I am very glad," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned her hand and held his back, and the stars above Harrow Creek, Texas, turned slowly overhead the way they always did, in the old pattern that had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. And under those stars 2 people sat together in the quiet of a life that was theirs, and it was good, and it was enough, and it was everything.